The sun was bleeding into the Atlantic when she first saw him. Megan O'Brien stood at the water's edge, barefoot in the sand, watching families pack up their coolers and fold umbrellas against the Norfolk evening. The beach at sunset was a place where people let their shoulders drop, where the roar of the waves drowned out the weight of ordinary days. She'd come here on her day off because the hospital, Seattle General, with its fluorescent corridors and the particular smell of antiseptic that clung to everything, had felt too small, too bright, too full of voices that needed her to be small in return. The ocean was different. The ocean asked nothing. She was walking the shoreline at 6:53 p.m., her sundress damp at the hem and her sandals hanging from one hand, when she heard the lifeguard's whistle cut through the wind. Not a casual warning. The urgent kind. The kind that meant someone's lungs had stopped remembering how to work. Her eyes found the water first, a flash of something pale, face down in the surf about 30 yards out. The lifeguard was still fumbling with his stand, young, moving like his body wasn't quite sure what speed to use. Families nearby were turning, noticing the shift from relaxation to something else rippling through the beach like a current. Megan didn't think. Thinking was the enemy of the first 30 seconds. She moved from standing to running in a single motion, muscle memory taking over, the kind that didn't come from 8 months of working trauma at Seattle General, the kind that came from something older, deeper, something sewn into her hands from a place she couldn't talk about. The water was cold, shocking, salt spray stinging her eyes as she drove forward, her sundress billowing around her like a parachute. 20 yards. 15. Her feet found the submerged shape and she was there, hands under arms, the man's weight sudden and terrible against her chest. The Coast Guard dress uniform told her rank before his face did. Commander, the insignia red, soggy and dark. She dragged him backward through the surf, her legs burning, her breathing controlled even as her pulse hammered in her throat. Not panic. Not anything close to panic. This was data. This was work. The sand of the beach proper scraped against her feet as she hauled him clear of the water, turning him immediately on his side, checking for obstruction in the airway. Clear. She rolled him onto his back. His chest wasn't moving right. The rise on the left side was there, but the other side, his right, was wrong. Flat. Tight. The way it moved told her everything. The lungs weren't filling symmetrically, and somewhere in his thoracic cavity, air had gotten where it shouldn't be and was pressing against the structures that wanted to stay in place. Tension pneumothorax. The clock had started the moment his lung collapsed. A crowd was forming. She could feel it around her like heat, people stopping, staring, phones appearing. The lifeguard was finally down from his stand and jogging toward her, his face the particular shade of panic that meant he'd seen the problem but hadn't yet solved it. Megan's hands moved on their own. She stripped the commander's shirt open, buttons scattering across the sand like shells. Her fingers found the landmarks, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the spaces between the ribs that were the only way to get air out before it killed him. 12 years of muscle memory didn't care that she was in a sundress at a public beach. 8 months of working trauma at Seattle General was nothing compared to what her hands already knew. She reached into her beach bag and pulled out the pen she always carried, ballpoint, plastic, the kind no one thought twice about. She'd learned long ago to keep simple tools in simple places. She twisted off the cap and the barrel, exposing the hollow tube inside. Her other hand pressed against the landmarks again, and she slid the needle through skin and muscle and into the space between the ribs where the pressure was building like a bomb. The hiss was immediate. Audible. The sound of compressed air escaping, the sound of a body realigning itself back toward survival. His eyes snapped open. Megan kept her hand steady, watching his oxygen saturation climb from somewhere terrible toward something survivable. In his eyes, she saw the moment he understood, not that he was alive, but that someone had known exactly what to do and had done it without hesitation, without permission, without any of the bureaucratic pause that usually preceded salvation. His mouth opened like he was going to ask her something, and she met his stare with a fractional shake of her head. Not here. Not now. Not ever, if she was careful. The lifeguard skidded to a stop beside her, breathless. "Oh my God! Oh my God, what do I?" he started, but she was already reaching for the commander's hand, placing it over the makeshift needle assembly. "Hold this. Don't move it. Ambulance is coming." She didn't phrase it as a question. The lifeguard nodded, his hands trembling, and she turned away without waiting for him to process the instruction. The crowd parted as she walked through it, still holding her sandals in one hand, her sundress dripping salt water onto the sand, her hand steady as surgical steel. Someone called out, "Thank you," or "What's your name?" or something else that required the kind of answer that would end up in a report somewhere, but she was already moving past them, disappearing into the swimmers and sunbathers and the general chaos of a Norfolk beach at dusk where people were already forgetting the moment someone had almost died. By the time the ambulance arrived at 7:04 p.m., Megan O'Brien was sitting in the parking lot with her feet rinsed and her sandals on, watching the paramedics load Commander Hayes onto a stretcher with the careful precision of people who understood what they were looking at. She didn't stick around for their questions. She'd learned, over years that existed in places she couldn't name on a resume, that the people who saved lives were rarely the ones who wanted to talk about it afterward. She drove back to her apartment in the silence of her own car, the ocean still humming in her ears. 48 hours later, at 7:31 a.m. on a Monday morning, Megan walked through the sliding doors of Seattle General's emergency department and punched her time card for her shift. The fluorescent lights were already their particular shade of white, the antiseptic smell already in her lungs. She wore her scrubs and her jacket, faded, older than the building itself, with a unit patch sewn inside the lining, a patch that no one would ever see unless she let them. Her hands were steady as she moved through the nurse's station, organizing her assignment, pulling up charts on the computer system. She didn't notice Dr. Pierce watching her from across the room, didn't see the way his eyes tracked her movements like someone measuring a problem he hadn't yet decided how to solve. What happened next would unfold over hours and days, a campaign of small destructions designed to convince the hospital that she didn't belong there, that she was the wrong kind of nurse, the wrong kind of person, that her steady hands and her quiet competence and the way patients kept requesting her by name were threats to a hierarchy that had to be defended. But in that moment, at 7:31 a.m., Megan O'Brien was simply beginning another shift, carrying the ocean on her skin and a secret in her chest and no way of knowing that the commander she'd left in the sand was about to walk into the trauma bay of this exact hospital. The first crack appeared on her third shift. Megan was changing an elderly patient's chest tube dressing when Dr. Pierce entered with two residents trailing behind him like remoras. His Ivy League diploma gleamed behind his desk back in his office. She'd seen it during the orientation tour he'd conducted personally, pointing it out twice, but his presence in the room felt like a temperature drop. "Nurse O'Brien," he said, not a question. "Walk us through your technique." She began explaining the dressing change, her voice steady and clinical. The patient's daughter watched from the corner chair, knitting needles still in her lap. Megan's hands moved with precision. She'd done this procedure 847 times in the past 8 months, and it showed. Her fingers barely trembled. The old man's breathing remained even. Dr. Pierce let her finish exactly one sentence before interrupting. "Fascinating. And where exactly did you study advanced wound care?" "Oh right, Norfolk Community College's weekend program." The resident smirked. One of them, a young man with carefully gelled hair, actually snorted. The patient's daughter set down her knitting and stared at her hands. Megan's jaw clenched once, briefly, a tremor that lasted maybe a quarter second. Her hands remained steady. She continued the dressing change without a word, her movements becoming even more precise, if that was possible. She didn't look at Dr. Pierce. She didn't acknowledge the residents. She simply finished the work, secured the new dressing with medical tape, and documented the vital signs on the chart. Dr. Pierce lingered, waiting for her to react, to apologize, to defend herself, to show some crack in her composure. She provided none. When she was done, she stepped back from the bed, made eye contact with the patient, and said, "You're all set, Mr. Chen. I'll be back in 2 hours to check on you." "Thank you, dear," the old man whispered, his voice wavering slightly. He clearly knew what had just happened. The break room at Seattle General smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of a space where people spent only as long as necessary. Megan sat alone at a table near the window, her sandwich unwrapped on a paper napkin, turkey on wheat, an apple, a bottle of water. She'd learned early that eating alone meant no one could use her eating time against her. Dr. Pierce entered with 4 other nurses, all women, all wearing the careful expression of people who'd been invited somewhere important. He scanned the room, and when his eyes landed on Megan, his smile widened like a shark recognizing blood in the water. "I prefer to eat where credentials are verified," he announced loudly, his voice pitched to carry across the entire room. He stood, made a great show of gathering his bag and his coffee cup. "Standards matter. They always matter." 3 nurses stood immediately, as if they'd been waiting for permission. One of them, Janet from the night shift, hesitated for exactly 3 seconds before following. The 4th nurse, a woman named Sarah who'd been kind to Megan during her first month, lingered just long enough to make eye contact, and in that eye contact was an apology, and then she left too. Megan ate her sandwich. She chewed each bite exactly 20 times. She drank her water. She ate her apple. Her knuckles whitened slightly around the apple stem, but that was the only reaction the room received. Her face remained absolutely neutral, the kind of neutral that comes from a lifetime of keeping everything locked behind ribs and muscle memory. The notice appeared on the unit board on a Thursday morning, posted at 6:53 a.m. by a nurse who wasn't Megan. Red ink. Official letterhead. Official right UP, Nurse O'Brien, failure to follow established protocols during code response, 11/3. Unorthodox procedures not approved by this department. Further violations will result in immediate termination. 15 staff members read it throughout the shift. Megan read it once, standing at the board with a patient's chart in her hand. The fluorescent lights hummed above her head like dying insects. The break room coffee maker gurgled in the background. She read every word twice, then turned and returned to her rounds. Her composure during humiliation was absolute. That was the thing Dr. Pierce didn't understand. He kept expecting her to crack, and she didn't crack. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply continued working, her hands steady, her voice professional, her presence occupying space in the hospital the way a stone occupies space in a river, unmovable, indifferent to the current. Only later, during her break, alone in the supply closet at 2:27 p.m., did she press her forehead against the cool metal shelving unit and exhale shakily. The sound was small, barely a breath, but it was there. Her shoulders remained straight. Her hands didn't tremble. But the exhale, that one exhale held 8 months of accumulated weight, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the residents who asked other nurses for explanations instead of asking her, the constant low-level gaslighting that wore on a person the way water wore on stone. She straightened her spine. She pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she left the supply closet and returned to the trauma bay, where a patient needed her hands and her steady voice and her uncanny ability to know what to do before the monitors even told her something was wrong. That evening, her 16-year-old son Daniel texted from home, "Mom, you okay?" Mrs. Chen said something happened at work. Mrs. Chen lived 3 doors down. She still taught at the elementary school. She must have run into Daniel's math tutor, or seen him at the grocery store, or heard through the parent network that usually knew everything before the news did. Megan waited until she was home to call him. She didn't explain what Dr. Pierce had said. She didn't explain the write-up. She simply said, "Some people are uncomfortable with change. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's about what they can't control." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is he trying to fire you?" "He's trying to find a reason to," Megan said carefully. "But I haven't given him one." What she didn't tell him was that Dr. Pierce was already making phone calls, building his case, moving pieces on a chessboard only he could see. She didn't tell him about the external investigator from the state licensing board, or the calls to her nursing school, or the 2 board members he'd contacted who owed him favors. She didn't tell him that her operational cover, the nursing license, the employment history, the carefully constructed identity that naval intelligence had built so she could monitor a medical supply diversion ring, was beginning to crack under the pressure of a man's ego. She simply said, "I love you. Get your homework done. Don't worry about me." The next morning, Commander Hayes arrived at Seattle General for follow-up treatment on his pneumothorax, and when Megan saw him at the nurse's station, his eyes widened with recognition. She'd pulled him from the water at Virginia Beach 2 days ago. She'd performed needle decompression on a drowning man, right there in the sand, her hands moving on muscle memory and combat training. And then she'd disappeared into the crowd before he'd fully regained consciousness. He recognized her immediately. His eyes said it all. But he said nothing. Not there. Not where Dr. Pierce could overhear or where the residents could watch or where the careful architecture of her cover could be compromised. During the complex chest tube insertion later that day, Hayes stopped mid-sentence about Coast Guard protocols and stared at her hand positioning. The way she held the 14-gauge angiocath needle. The angle of her approach. The precision that came from something deeper than nursing school training. "That's a combat medic technique," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Field expedient. I've only seen it done that way in forward operating areas." Megan's hands didn't pause, but her eyes flicked to his face. That same fractional head shake. "Not here. Not now." Hayes lowered his voice further. "I was Navy corpsman before I transferred to Coast Guard. Deployed to Ramadi, 2014 to 2015. I know that technique because a Marine medic taught it to me. Call sign was Reaper. During a mass casualty event. That medic saved 17 lives in a single afternoon using exactly the approach you just demonstrated." Megan's hands finally stilled. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the mask slipped, just barely, just for a second, and Hayes saw everything. The woman who'd pulled him from the water. The operative who'd trained with the best. The captain who'd given orders in the dark and meant them. "Not here," Megan whispered. "I'm on a mission. The nursing job is the mission. I'm monitoring a medical supply diversion ring. Naval intelligence placed me here as operational cover. 6 months of work. If it blows, everything collapses." "How long?" Hayes asked. 2 more weeks. Then I disappear and they never know I was anything but a nurse." Hayes nodded slowly, understanding flooding his face like sunrise. He'd been field-trained enough to know what it meant to trust someone with a secret that could end careers. More than that, he understood what it meant to sacrifice visible recognition for invisible purpose. That evening, as Megan drove home through Norfolk traffic, Dr. Pierce's investigator was filing a preliminary report. The nursing credentials checked out as legitimate, but there were gaps in her employment history. Unexplained transfers. A 6-month period in 2018 with no documentation. Another gap in 2016. The pattern was odd. Strategic, almost. Deliberately constructed to hide something. Dr. Pierce read the report and smiled. He reached for his phone. He had board members to call. He had investigators to push. He had a timeline now. He could smell it, the inconsistency, the secret, the thing Megan O'Brien was hiding. And if he could prove she'd falsified any part of her credentials, he could destroy her. But that wasn't the worst part. The waiting room of Seattle General had that particular stillness of evening visiting hours, fluorescent lights casting everything in institutional white, when the man in the gray cardigan simply stopped mid-sentence and tilted sideways into the vinyl chair like someone had switched off his power. His wife was holding a casserole dish. She screamed once, sharp and clean, a sound that cut through the ambient hum of the lobby like glass breaking underwater. Megan heard it from the trauma corridor, 300 feet away, but her body moved before her mind caught up. Years of training did that. Muscle memory took over before conscious thought could interfere. She was at the waiting room in 12 seconds, badge clipped and moving, already reading the collapsed man's presentation as she closed the distance. Ashen skin. Lips the color of old bruises. Respiration at maybe 4 breaths per minute, more gasping than breathing. The The wife was crying his name repeatedly, a sound like a broken record. "Step back." Megan's voice dropped into the controlled register she'd learned in combat medicine courses in Ramadi, not the deferential tone she'd been using in this hospital for 8 months. She was already checking for a pulse at the carotid, nothing there, or nothing she could find in the chaos. His chest wasn't rising. "Get me a crash cart. Now." Someone call code blue. The waiting room staff scattered like startled birds. Megan rolled the man onto his back on the tile floor, the cardigan bunching under his shoulders, and positioned her hands for compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4, the rhythm steady and perfect, her shoulders driving down with mechanical precision, using her entire body weight rather than just arm strength. The broken ribs were already forming under her palms, she could feel the subtle crackle as the fractures began, but broken ribs meant effective compressions, meant the heart was being squeezed with enough force to move blood. Pain is data. Data saves lives. Dr. Pierce arrived before the crash cart, materializing at the periphery of the scene with that particular expression of controlled superiority he wore during emergencies, the one that suggested he'd been born knowing things the rest of the world would spend lifetimes learning. Behind him, Megan caught movement in the hospital corridor, Commander Hayes, still in a patient gown, one for pole trailing behind him like a mechanical shadow. He was watching. Of course he was watching. He already knew what she was. "Continue compressions," Dr. Pierce ordered, his voice cutting through the ambient chaos. "Get me an EKG stat. Someone get the crash cart to the east waiting room, we need to move him to Rhesus." The staff moved with practiced efficiency. The cart arrived, gleaming stainless steel and plastic, bristling with paddles and syringes and the controlled technology of modern emergency medicine. Megan kept compressions going, her hands steady as surgical lasers, not breaking rhythm as 2 orderlies positioned themselves to move the patient onto the stretcher. 30 compressions, every one perfect, every one delivering the message to a dying heart, keep going, keep going, keep going. 2-minute mark, someone called out, Jessica, one of the junior nurses, tracking time on her phone. Megan didn't pause. Didn't acknowledge. The world had narrowed to this, the patient's sternum, the pressure she was applying, the mathematics of survival. They moved him during the next round of compressions, a practiced choreography of orderlies and nurses, and Megan continued the chest compressions while walking backward down the corridor, maintaining rhythm, maintaining pressure. The EKG monitor showed asystole, a flat line, the absence of any electrical activity, the sound that meant the heart had stopped commanding the body. But there was something else, something subtle in the patient's presentation, something in the way his chest had resisted her initial compressions, the specific tension in the thoracic cavity. They reached the Reese's Bay. Megan transferred compressions to one of the critical care nurses, a man named Reeves who'd been doing this for 16 years, and stepped back for precisely 1 second, just long enough to let him take position. That was when the thought crystallized: tension pneumothorax. The specific resistance of the chest cavity, the ashen cyanosis, the way his neck veins were distended even under compression. She'd seen this 3 times in Ramadi, seen it kill 2 soldiers before anyone understood what was happening. "Dr. Pierce," Megan said, her voice cutting through the organized chaos of the Reese's Bay, "I think we need to consider a tension pneumothorax." His presentation, the specific resistance on compressions, the JVD, the color progression. "Nurse O'Brien, I'm running this code." His voice was ice water poured into a metal container, a sound that had no warmth in it, no room for negotiation. "Follow my orders or step away from my patient." The Reese's Bay went very quiet. Not silent, there was the ventilator hissing, the monitor beeping its useless rhythm, the soft sounds of 4 lines being secured, but quiet in the way a room goes quiet when something fundamental has shifted, when a boundary has been crossed. Megan could feel the eyes on her, could sense the hierarchy being enforced in real time. Nurse. Doctor. Order. Obedience. The old structure, crystallized in a single moment of crisis. Commander Hayes was visible through the Reese's Bay window, still in his patient gown, still holding his 4-pole. His expression hadn't changed. But something in his posture had, he'd gone very still, the way a predator goes still right before it moves. Megan looked at the patient. A man in a grey cardigan who'd been holding his wife's casserole dish 30 seconds ago. His skin had progressed from ashen to something darker, something closer to slate. His pupils were dilating. The ticking clock was audible now, even if nobody else could hear it. 2 minutes without adequate perfusion was the threshold. After that, brain death started. After 5 minutes, it was usually irreversible. She made her choice. 14-gauge angiocath, Megan said, her voice calm and clear as glacier ice. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. I need it now. Dr. Pierce's head snapped toward her like she'd physically struck him. Nurse O'Brien. But Megan was already moving, already positioning herself at the patient's right chest wall, already locating the landmarks by feel and memory and the weight of muscle memory from a field hospital in Ramadi, from nights when the attending physician was unconscious from blood loss and the responsibility had fallen to her. Her hands found the space between the ribs, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the classic location for needle decompression in a tension pneumothorax. The needle went in smooth and fast, a practice motion, and for a second nothing happened. Then the hiss of air escaping. The sound was small but unmistakable, the specific noise of pressure releasing, of a lung re-expanding, of physics correcting itself. The patient's oxygen saturation, which had been dropping toward the single digits, suddenly climbed, 72, 78, 85, 91. The EKG monitor produced a rhythm. Not normal, but present, a sinus rhythm, shaky but alive, the electrical activity of a heart that had been given oxygen and had remembered how to beat. The entire rhesus bay had stopped moving. Megan could feel the weight of that stillness, the specific gravity of a professional boundary being crossed, of a nurse doing something a nurse was not supposed to know how to do, not supposed to be trained in, not supposed to execute with such absolute certainty. She stepped back from the patient, her hands at her sides, her face completely neutral. "Get him to ICU," she said, her voice the voice of someone giving orders, not requests. "Type and cross, massive transfusion protocol. He's going to need a CT and likely a chest tube placement. Move." The staff moved. They moved because the tone of her voice left no room for negotiation, because she'd just saved a man's life using a procedure most nurses at Seattle General had only read about in textbooks, because something fundamental had shifted in the hierarchy of that room and everybody knew it. Dr. Pierce stood frozen, his hand still half raised from the compression he'd been about to deliver, his face going through a series of expressions like a man watching something he understood break down into components he couldn't reassemble. The patient went to ICU. The visitors went to the waiting room. The staff dispersed back to their stations. Megan walked to the break room and poured herself a cup of coffee that had been sitting since shift change, the kind of coffee that tasted like regret and machine oil. She took one sip. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was normal. But somewhere in her chest, in a place below the ribs and above the stomach, something had already begun to fracture. By midnight, Dr. Pierce had made 3 phone calls. By 6 a.m., he'd made 7 more. By the time Megan arrived for her next shift, 16 hours later, everything had begun to collapse. The hospital administrator's office called her at 7:24 a.m. The words came through the phone like bullets. "We've received complaints regarding your credential verification, and state licensing board representatives will be conducting a review, and for now, you're on immediate suspension pending investigation." She was walking out of Seattle General by 8:23 a.m., a cardboard box in her hands containing her personal items, a cracked coffee mug, a dying succulent, a photograph of her husband in dress blues from 9 years ago, from before Ramadi, from before everything changed. Her intelligence handler had sent a text at 8:04 a.m., cover blown. Mission aborted. The supply diversion ring scattered when they heard state was investigating. 6 months of work, gone. The rain was hammering down on the parking lot and Megan stood at the edge of it with the cardboard box in her arms, watching water stream down the windshields of cars, watching the hospital recede behind sheets of grey, and for the first time in 8 months, felt the full weight of everything she'd been carrying. The quiet composure was still there, still intact, still absolute, but underneath it, something had cracked. And she had no idea that in the next 48 hours, everything was about to be rebuilt. The waiting room collapsed in on itself at 3:24 p.m. on a Tuesday. A visitor, 63 years old, cardiac history, no insurance, went down hard beside the vending machine. Chest pain radiating into his jaw. Breathing like a man drowning in air. The nurses froze. The security guard reached for his radio. But Megan was already moving, her hand steady as surgical steel, and she cut through the crowd with the kind of purpose that made people step aside without thinking about why. Needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. 14-gauge angiocath. One smooth motion. The hiss of air escaping, that beautiful, unmistakable sound of a lung re-inflating, and the man's face went from purple-grey to something resembling human again. Oxygen saturation climbing, 68. 74, 81. 88, stable. Dr. Pierce watched from the hallway, his Armani tie perfectly aligned, his face perfectly composed. But his eyes were moving, calculating, hunting for the angle that had eluded him for 8 months. He had it now. The phone call started before the man was even transferred to ICU. Dr. Pierce sat in his office with the door closed, his leather chair creaking beneath him as he leaned back, 3 numbers dialed into his private line within 20 minutes. Board member Castellano owed him a favor from a golf trip to Scottsdale. Board member Hyatt's daughter had gotten into Stanford because of a recommendation letter Pierce had written. Both calls lasted exactly 90 seconds each. Just some credential inconsistencies we'd like to verify, Pierce said, his voice smooth as bourbon. Routine background review. Nothing dramatic. But if we find discrepancies, the liability exposure becomes problematic. The third call took longer. He reached the director of the Washington State Nursing Board's disciplinary division, a woman named Patricia Olmsted who'd never heard of Megan O'Brien but who understood institutional liability the way other people understood breathing. An external investigator, Pierce said. Someone with federal authority. I have concerns about the completeness of her employment verification. The resume doesn't quite align with what I'm finding through my own channels. What channels those were, he didn't specify. What he had actually found, which was nothing, he didn't mention. Patricia Olmsted didn't ask. By Thursday morning, a state investigator named Robert Chen was standing in the HR office at Seattle General with a subpoena for Megan's complete personnel file, nursing school transcripts, licensing documentation, and a request to interview her references. Megan knew none of this. She worked her shifts. She saved a patient with septic shock. She talked a 19-year-old out of self-harm by sitting with him for 40 minutes without saying much of anything. She ate her lunch alone in the break room because nobody sat with her anymore. Pierce's invisible poison had worked better than any slander could have. The other nurses were polite. They were just never there. On Friday, she was doing a routine medication count when Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway, his presence making the air pressure change like a storm front rolling in. Ms. O'Brien. Administrator's office. 20 minutes. She didn't ask why. She clocked out. She walked down 3 corridors and took the elevator up 2 floors, her heart rate steady, her breathing even, her hands carrying no tremor. Just habit. Just training. Just the thing that had kept her alive in Ramadi when everything else had failed. The administrator, Gerald Martinez, looked uncomfortable. There was an investigator there. Papers everywhere. Her original job application. Her transcripts from Mercy General School of Nursing. References that someone had called, apparently, but she had no memory of anyone calling them, which was odd, because her references were her training officer from her Navy days, her direct supervisor from her first civilian position, and a physician she'd worked with at Johns Hopkins for 18 months. We've encountered some discrepancies, Martinez said, not meeting her eyes. The dates on your resume don't align with your licensure records, the investigator said. His name was Chen. He looked exhausted, like he'd already figured out this was a waste of his time but was going through the paperwork anyway. And when we contacted your nursing school references, they couldn't locate any record of you in their system from the years you indicated. Megan's jaw clenched. Once. Briefly. That's because I didn't attend a civilian nursing school, she said quietly. My training was military. Medical Field Service School, Naval Medical Center, San Diego. My discharge papers should be in my application materials. Chen flipped through the file. His face changed. They're not here. Then they were never submitted, Megan said. Her voice had dropped half an octave. Someone requesting my records should have asked me directly, rather than calling numbers I never provided. Martinez shifted in his chair. Ms. O'Brien, I'm not sure how to say this, but given these complications and the concerns that have been raised about your credential authenticity, we're going to have to suspend your employment pending a full investigation by the state board. The room went so quiet she could hear the fluorescent lights buzz. How long? She asked. Could be weeks. Could be months. But until this is cleared, you can't work patient care. She nodded. Once. Her face remained absolutely flat, like someone had poured concrete into her bones. She stood up. She walked to the door. Dr. Pierce was standing in the hallway, of course he was, and when she passed him, he smiled. A thin, victorious smile that looked like a scar. She didn't smile back. She didn't speak. She just kept walking. Security escorted her to her locker at 5:32 p.m. A guard named Rashard, who'd always been kind to her, looked genuinely upset as he watched her empty it. A cracked coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded lettering. A dying succulent in a plastic pot that she'd been meaning to water for 2 weeks. A photograph in a frame, her husband in navy dress blues, dark eyes, that half-smile he'd perfected before his 3rd deployment. Before Ramadi. Before he didn't come home. She tucked the photograph on top of the other's items, creating a small tower inside a cardboard box someone found for her. The faded unit patch sewn into her jacket lining, the one from her first tour, from the worst year, from the year she earned her call sign, pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. The rain started at 6:15 p.m. She stood at the bus stop 3 blocks from Seattle General, the cardboard box disintegrating slowly in her arms, water seeping through the bottom. The photograph slipped. She caught it. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, not from sadness, but from the effort of restraint. From the sheer physical cost of not kicking through the plexiglass shelter. From the effort of not screaming into the rain like a wounded animal. Headlights blurred past. A dozen cars. No bus. She didn't move. Her phone buzzed. 17 missed calls from Daniel. 3 from Commander Hayes. 1 from an unknown number. She stared at the screen for 30 seconds, then powered it off. The bus never came. She walked instead. 3 miles in the downpour, the box falling apart, the photograph growing soft at the edges, the smell of rain and diesel exhaust mixing with the medical-grade antiseptic that had soaked into her clothes. By the time she reached her apartment, her hair was plastered to her skull, her scrubs were transparent with water, and her son was waiting on the porch with panic blooming across his 16-year-old face. Mom, what happened? Daniel's voice cracked. Why are you home? Why didn't you answer your phone? She couldn't tell him the truth. Operational security still had its hooks in her, even now, even broken, even fired. She set the box down carefully on the porch table. Just work politics, honey, she said. I'll find something else. But her voice cracked on the last word, the only piece of her armor that gave way, and Daniel's expression hardened into something that looked like his father's. Like someone who'd just decided to stop asking questions and start finding answers instead. That night, when she was in the shower trying to rinse out the rain and the day and the failure, Daniel went to the storage unit in the basement where she kept the gear she never talked about. The boxes labeled old stuff. The shadow box she'd never shown him, wrapped in plastic, hidden behind a stack of winter coats. He opened it at 2 a.m., sitting on their kitchen floor in the dark, his hand shaking as he read the lettering on the medals. Bronze Star with Valor. Navy Cross nomination paperwork. Combat photos. Citations that called his mother captain. Citations that described her actions in combat zones in language that made his teenage worldview crack open. By 6 a.m., he was dressed in his school clothes, the shadow box under his arm, and he was walking to Seattle General with a purpose that burned like a fever. The administrator's office smelled like leather and expensive coffee. Not the kind the nurses drank. The severance papers lay across the desk in 3 organized stacks, each one a small death. Megan's pen hovered over the signature line, her hand steady as surgical steel, when the door burst open so hard it cracked against the wall. Daniel stood in the doorway in his school clothes, breathing like he'd run the whole way, and he was holding a shadow box. Megan's chest seized. Just once. Just for a fraction of a second. The medals and ribbons inside caught the fluorescent light, bronze, purple, navy blue. Ribbons that told stories she'd spent 9 years keeping locked inside her ribcage. Her son's voice cracked like he was 12 again, standing at his father's funeral. "Mom, they need to see these." Before she could move, before she could even breathe, the office door opened again and Commander Hayes stepped forward from where he'd been standing quietly in the corner the entire time. His uniform was pressed so sharp it looked like it could draw blood. His eyes met hers with the clarity of someone who'd already made his decision. "I know, Reaper," he said. Simple. Declarative. That's her call sign. The administrator's face went pale. Megan stood. The chair scraped backward. Daniel moved closer to her, the shadow box trembling in his hands. A Marine colonel appeared in the hallway beyond the door, and he was holding a leather folder that looked older than the building itself. He began reading, his voice carrying the weight of official record, the kind of voice that made air pressure change. Captain Megan O'Brien, Bronze Star with Valor, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Ramadi. Megan. Captain. The words hung in the air like shrapnel suspended before it falls. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then a 2-star general emerged behind the colonel, and without a word, without any ceremony beyond the precision of it, he rendered a crisp salute to the decorations in Daniel's shadow box. Not to Megan. To what she'd done. To who she was beneath the scrubs and the silence. The administrator started to say something, some small sound of protest, of confusion, when a woman in a dark suit stepped past the general and placed a single hand on the desk. She wasn't tall. She didn't raise her voice. She just looked at Dr. Pierce's empty chair and spoke like she was ordering coffee. Captain O'Brien is a defense intelligence asset operating under codename Nightingale. Her cover was compromised by this facility's ER director. That constitutes federal obstruction. The door opened again. FBI agents in blue windbreakers. 2 of them. They moved with the terrifying fluid precision of people who'd done this 1,000 times before. By evening, a shift change was happening and every nurse and doctor in Seattle General was clocking in or out. Dr. Pierce was being escorted through the main lobby in handcuffs. His face was bright red, veins bulging at his temples like he was about to stroke out. He was shouting about his rights, his credentials, his board connections, the injustice of it all, while 200 hospital staff watched in absolute silence. The handcuffs caught the light as he passed the nurse's station. It wasn't a request. It was a perp walk. A public destruction of everything he'd built on the foundation of humiliating people he thought were beneath him. The investigators he'd hired, the ones he'd paid to destroy Megan's record, they testified against him. He'd forged employment documents. He'd fabricated disciplinary reports. He'd attempted to destroy evidence of her security clearance. Federal crimes. Actual, prosecutable federal crimes that would send him to a facility with bars on the windows. The medical board suspended his license pending trial. His colleagues from Johns Hopkins and Harvard issued statements distancing themselves, the kind of statements that killed careers more effectively than criminal charges. The board members who'd owed him favors stopped answering their phones. His wife filed for divorce when the news outlets reported that he'd been skimming hospital research funds for 7 years. Within 2 weeks he was awaiting trial, stripped of his license, his marriage, his standing. The hospital offered him severance in exchange for his resignation. He took it because the alternative was being tried in open court. Then came the temp agency job. Medical supply van. Loading boxes. The same boxes he'd once dismissed as beneath his notice. Megan's intelligence handler debriefed her in a secure room at the federal building downtown. The supply ring investigation hadn't been a total loss. Dr. Pierce's escalation had forced the thieves to move their product early, accelerating their timeline, and that early movement had put them directly into FBI surveillance. 3 arrests, including the senior pharmacy tech who'd been diverting medications for 8 months. The mission succeeded despite the blown cover. It just succeeded differently than anyone had planned. Commander Hayes visited her at her apartment 3 days later. He stood on her porch in civilian clothes, and he looked smaller somehow, less like a warrior and more like a man who understood what it meant to be rescued by someone you'd never properly thanked. "My entire station wants to meet you," he said. 50 personnel. "We'd like to hold a ceremony, if you'll allow it." Megan didn't answer immediately. She looked at his face, scarred from the training accident, still healing, and she thought through the windows of the main entrance, Megan could see the parking lot. Dr. Pierce was out there, loading boxes into a medical supply van. His once pristine career, the one built on Ivy League credentials and connections and the systematic humiliation of people he decided were beneath him, was now reduced to manual labor. He glanced up through the glass, saw the ceremony, saw the military uniforms and the admiral and his former ER department gathered around someone who wasn't him. His face contorted, not anger, but something deeper, something like the moment you realize you've built your entire life on a foundation of sand. He turned away and loaded another box. Inside, the admiral stepped forward and pinned the Navy cross to Megan's uniform. The moment was silent except for the soft click of the pin securing. Daniel watched from the side, tears streaming down his face openly, unashamed. Hayes read the citation in a voice that carried across the lobby like a prayer. For extraordinary heroism while serving as combat medic during sustained enemy engagement in Ramadi, where Captain O'Brien exposed herself to direct fire 47 times over 6 hours to reach wounded Marines, performing emergency procedures under fire that saved 17 critical casualties who would otherwise have been expectant. 47 times. 17 lives. The numbers hung in the air like they carried weight. The hospital administrator approached her afterward, extending the ER director position, the job that had belonged to Dr. Pierce, the throne from which he'd issued his small cruelties. Megan declined with the kind of grace that made people understand she'd never been fighting for a position. She'd been fighting to survive. "I'm accepting a role at the VA hospital," she said. Her voice was steady now, deeper than it had been 9 months ago when she was trying to disappear into the walls of Seattle General. "Working with veterans. The ones who understand what it means to serve in silence." Hayes saluted her with the precision of someone saluting not just a fellow officer, but a hero. "Thank you for saving my life, Reaper. Both times. Once on the beach, and once by showing us that heroism doesn't need recognition to be real." Megan's voice came out like a statement of fact. "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most." She walked out of Seattle General with Daniel on one side and her Coast Guard honor guard on the other, the unit patch from Ramadi finally visible in the light where it belonged. Behind them, through the lobby windows, Dr. Pierce's medical supply van pulled away from the parking lot, disappearing into traffic and rain, becoming less and less real with each block. Captain Megan O'Brien didn't look back. If this story resonates with you, if you know someone who's been underestimated, if you've ever had to carry a burden in silence, please like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what you would have done in Megan's position. Because the real heroes often aren't the ones wearing badges. They're the ones holding stethoscopes. They're the ones standing in the rain at a bus stop with nowhere to go, and somehow, they still show up to save someone else's life.